What if I told you that buying a used car from Craigslist could lead you to discover that you've been living next door to one of the FBI's most wanted criminals for over 15 years, and that this discovery would put your entire family in mortal danger? This is the terrifying true story of how Jake Morrison's simple attempt to buy a cheap car uncovered a witness protection scandal that reached the highest levels of federal law enforcement and revealed that his quiet suburban neighborhood was actually a carefully constructed lie. Jake Morrison was a typical 35-year-old suburban dad living in what he thought was the safest neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, was married to his college sweetheart Lisa, and had two young children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids played safely in the streets, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual block party. Jake had lived in the same house for 12 years, right next door to his neighbor Bob Patterson, a quiet man in his 60s who claimed to be a retired insurance salesman. Bob was the perfect neighbor. He kept his lawn immaculate, never made noise, and was always willing to help with small favors like accepting packages or keeping an eye on the house when the Morrisons went on vacation. Jake's kids loved Uncle Bob, who would give them candy and tell them stories about his travels around the country during his insurance career. The discovery that would turn Jake's world upside down began when he decided to buy a used pickup truck to help with home improvement projects. He had been browsing Craigslist for several weeks when he found what seemed like the perfect deal: a well-maintained Ford F-150 being sold by someone in the next town over for significantly below market value. The seller, who identified himself as Mike Thompson, said he needed to sell quickly because he was moving out of state for a new job. Jake drove to the address Mike had given him, which turned out to be a modest house in a working-class neighborhood about 30 miles from his own home. When Mike came out to show him the truck, something about the man seemed familiar, but Jake couldn't place where he might have seen him before. Mike was nervous and seemed eager to complete the sale quickly, barely giving Jake time to inspect the vehicle before accepting his cash offer. It wasn't until Jake was driving the truck home that he realized why Mike had seemed familiar. Without the baseball cap and sunglasses Mike had been wearing, and viewed from a different angle in Jake's rearview mirror, Mike looked remarkably similar to Bob Patterson. Not just similar, they looked like the same person, just with different hair color and facial hair. Jake's first thought was that it was just a coincidence, but the resemblance was so striking that he couldn't stop thinking about it. When he got home, he mentioned the similarity to his wife Lisa, who laughed it off and suggested that Jake was seeing things. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the encounter. Over the next few days, Jake found himself paying closer attention to Bob Patterson's behavior and appearance. He noticed things that had never seemed significant before: how Bob never seemed to get mail from friends or family, how he never mentioned specific details about his supposed insurance career, and how he seemed to know an unusual amount about topics that didn't seem related to insurance sales, like advanced security systems and firearms. Jake's suspicions were further aroused when he noticed that Bob's reaction to certain topics of conversation seemed inconsistent with his claimed background. When Jake mentioned visiting Chicago for work, Bob had made a comment about a specific restaurant that had closed down years earlier, but when Jake asked Bob about his time working in Chicago, Bob claimed he had never lived there. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense that something was wrong, Jake decided to do some basic internet research on Bob Patterson. What he found was disturbing. There was virtually no online presence for Bob Patterson, no social media accounts, no business listings from his supposed insurance career, and no public records that seemed to match Bob's claimed background. Jake's research skills were limited, but he was persistent. He began searching through old newspaper archives and public records databases, looking for any mention of Bob Patterson in connection with insurance companies or other legitimate businesses. What he found instead was something that made his blood run cold. In a newspaper archive from 15 years earlier, Jake found a small article about a federal witness protection case that had gone wrong. The article mentioned that a key witness in a major organized crime trial had disappeared from protective custody, and that federal marshals were searching for him. The witness was described as a former accountant for a crime family who had agreed to testify in exchange for protection, but who had fled when he learned that his location had been compromised. The article didn't include a photo, but it did include a name that made Jake's heart race: Robert Patterson, also known as Bobby, the Books, Petroni, former financial manager for the Castellano crime family. According to the article, Patterson had been responsible for laundering millions of dollars for the crime family and had detailed knowledge of their operations that could have sent dozens of people to prison. Jake realized that his quiet, helpful neighbor Bob was actually a federal fugitive who had been living under a false identity for over 15 years. But the implications were even more terrifying than Jake initially understood. If Bob was really Bobby Petroni, then Jake's family had been living next door to someone who was being hunted by both federal law enforcement and organized crime figures who wanted him dead. Jake's first instinct was to call the police immediately, but something made him hesitate. If Bob really was a dangerous fugitive, then confronting him or alerting authorities might put Jake's family in immediate danger. Jake decided he needed more evidence before taking any action, so he began conducting more detailed surveillance of his neighbor. What Jake observed over the next few weeks confirmed his worst fears. Bob received visitors at odd hours who didn't look like typical friends or relatives. Jake noticed that Bob had multiple cell phones and seemed to use different ones for different conversations. Most disturbing of all, Jake observed Bob conducting what appeared to be business meetings in his backyard, always late at night and always with people who looked like they were trying to avoid being seen. Jake also noticed that Bob's house had security features that were far more sophisticated than what a retired insurance salesman would need. There were multiple cameras, motion sensors, and what appeared to be reinforced doors and windows. Jake realized that Bob's house was essentially a fortress designed to protect someone who was expecting to be attacked. The situation became even more dangerous when Jake discovered that Bob had noticed his increased attention. Jake started receiving anonymous phone calls where the caller would hang up without speaking. His car was vandalized twice in his own driveway. Most frightening of all, Jake came home one day to find that someone had been in his house while his family was away. Nothing was stolen, but items had been moved slightly, as if someone had been searching for something. Jake realized that Bob suspected he was being watched and was trying to intimidate him into backing off. But Jake also knew that if Bob was really Bobby Petroni, then his family was already in danger just by living next door to him. If Bob's location was ever discovered by his enemies, Jake's family could easily become collateral damage in any violence that followed. After weeks of agonizing over the decision, Jake finally decided to contact the FBI. He was careful to use a secure phone and to meet with agents at a location far from his neighborhood. When he presented his evidence and suspicions to federal agents, their reaction confirmed his worst fears. They immediately recognized the name Bobby Petroni and confirmed that he had been a high-priority fugitive for over 15 years. The FBI agents explained that Bobby Petroni had been one of the most valuable witnesses in the history of organized crime prosecutions, but that he had fled from witness protection when he learned that there was a leak in the program that had compromised his location. The federal marshals had been searching for him ever since, both to protect him and to bring him to justice for fleeing from protective custody. What the FBI agents told Jake next was even more disturbing. Bobby Petroni hadn't just been an accountant for the Castellano crime family, he had been their primary money launderer and had been involved in planning several murders. He had detailed knowledge of corruption within law enforcement agencies and had information that could have exposed criminal activity by dozens of officials. His testimony had been crucial in several major prosecutions, but his disappearance had allowed many criminals to escape justice. The FBI immediately began planning an operation to capture Bobby Petroni, but they warned Jake that the situation was extremely dangerous. If Bobby realized that he had been discovered, he might flee again, or worse, he might try to eliminate any witnesses to his presence in the neighborhood. The agents also warned Jake that other criminals might be watching Bobby's house, looking for an opportunity to kill him, and that Jake's family could be in danger from both sides of the conflict. The federal operation to capture Bobby Petroni was carefully planned and executed in the early morning hours when Jake's children would be safely at school. FBI agents surrounded Bobby's house while federal marshals approached the front door. Jake and his family were evacuated to a safe location before the operation began, and they watched from a distance as their quiet suburban street was transformed into a war zone. Bobby Petroni didn't go quietly. When federal agents announced their presence, he barricaded himself inside his house and began destroying evidence. The standoff lasted for several hours, during which Bobby made several phone calls that agents later discovered were attempts to contact criminal associates who might help him escape or eliminate witnesses to his capture. The standoff ended when Bobby realized that his situation was hopeless and that resistance would only make his legal problems worse. He surrendered peacefully, but not before making it clear that he knew Jake had been responsible for his capture and that he would not forget that betrayal. Bobby's arrest made national news, not just because of his long time as a fugitive, but because of the implications for the Witness Protection Program. His case revealed significant flaws in how protected witnesses were monitored and how their security was maintained. It also raised questions about how many other fugitives from the Witness Protection Program were living undetected in suburban communities across the country. The legal aftermath was complex and lengthy. Bobby Petroni was charged with fleeing from witness protection, obstruction of justice, and several other federal crimes. During his trial, it was revealed that he had been living comfortably for 15 years using a false identity that he had created with the help of criminal associates who specialized in document forgery. The trial also revealed the extent of Bobby's criminal activities while he was supposedly in hiding. He had not been quietly living as a retired insurance salesman. He had been actively involved in money laundering operations and had been providing financial services to criminals across the Midwest. His house had been a hub for criminal activity that had been operating right under the noses of his unsuspecting neighbors. For Jake and his family, the aftermath of Bobby's arrest was traumatic and life-changing. They had to live with the knowledge that they had been unknowingly living next door to a dangerous criminal for over 15 years. They also had to deal with the fear that Bobby's criminal associates might target them for revenge, forcing them to accept federal protection and eventually relocate to a different state. The experience changed Jake's perspective on safety and security in ways that affected every aspect of his life. He became much more cautious about his family's activities and more aware of potential dangers in their environment. He also became an advocate for better oversight of the Witness Protection Program and worked with federal agencies to improve procedures for monitoring protected witnesses. Jake's discovery of Bobby Petroni's true identity also led to the reopening of several cold cases related to organized crime activities in the Midwest. Information found in Bobby's house provided crucial evidence that helped solve murders and other serious crimes that had remained unsolved for years. Today, Jake and his family live under assumed names in a different state, still under federal protection due to ongoing concerns about their safety. Jake works as a consultant helping federal agencies improve their procedures for protecting witnesses and their families. His experience has become a case study used in training programs for federal marshals and FBI agents. The most important lesson from Jake's story is that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that even the most ordinary suburban neighborhoods can hide extraordinary secrets. His decision to trust his instincts and investigate his suspicions, despite the personal risk, not only protected his own family but also helped bring a dangerous fugitive to justice and exposed flaws in the federal witness protection system that needed to be addressed. Jake often reflects on how different his life might have been if he had never bought that truck from Craigslist or if he had ignored his suspicions about Bob Patterson. While the discovery of the truth destroyed his family's sense of security and forced them to rebuild their lives in a new location, Jake knows that his actions probably saved lives and helped ensure that dangerous criminals faced justice for their crimes.